Good morning and welcome again to Anthropology 4310. Are there any questions about anything that we've covered in the previous two lectures? No questions? Everybody's happy. Okay. Last time I kind of went over some of the information that I presented in the first lecture merely to expand on it and to, I think, give you some greater depth or background or at least more discussion of some of those points, so hopefully they're clearer to you. And let me just make one comment that on that part, that in the future we'll also have more occasions to talk about this interconnection between culture, technology, and environment. I remember how informative I found some notions about industrialization and what that brought about in terms of everyday life among Western peoples as it increased in its impact upon Western cultures. And so I think that's an important consideration to bring to you in this class. And as I say, in the future I'll have a little more to say about it, a little more expansive discussion, I hope. Last time we also talked about a little bit those historical periods and American anthropology, and those historical periods were capitalism triumphant, intermittent liberal reform, and the military-industrial complex. If you recall, these were three periods or three chapters in American history that were labeled. I take these labels from an article by Eric Wolf published in 1969. So it's a dated article, but it takes that kind of an aged article, if you will, to talk about this subject. I haven't really seen anything that covers it in quite this way in more recent publications. Capitalism triumphant in terms of anthropological theory would refer or relate to classical evolutionary theory. The intermittent liberal reform would refer to cultural relativism in the American school under the aegis of Franz Boas. And the third, military-industrial complex, somehow should relate to cultural materialism and its emergence. But at the same time that cultural materialism was becoming the predominant or dominant mode of expression for anthropological theory, it was also, at the same time, or simultaneously, there was this beginning development of postmodernism or post-structuralism, as we refer to it. So that that's an important notion as well, because when people, as you'll find out, I think, when Dr. Rasmussen in a later lecture gives you that lecture on from modernism to postmodernism and from structuralism to post-structuralism, it's a very fancy title and very intriguing, called Paradigms Lost, or Paradigms Lost, obviously based on a literary metaphor. What really refers to modernism would be that cultural relativism and that period of intermittent liberal reform. It would be the period of anthropology that was predominant at the time that I first became an anthropology student. So I feel that I know it very well, and I also have been around for the evolution of this movement into post-structuralism and postmodernism. At the same time, I've been around for the development of materialist notions. So this is, while it's a very current argument, as I'm indicating, between materialism and humanism, and those thoughts in the social sciences generally, and anthropology in particular, it's also something that's really part and parcel. It's characteristic of all of Western civilization in terms of this 15th, 16th, 17th centuries as well, and the 18th. So it's an argument that's evolved over time. It's something that is important to this class. It's something that's important for the development of theory in all of the social sciences, as I indicated also as well in the natural sciences, and to some extent also in the fine arts and humanities. I question, as I think I told you the last time, about labeling it the military-industrial complex. I think that military-industrial complex is certainly firmly entrenched. It's certainly installed, if you will, as represented by multinational corporations and their control of what's happening. I'll just make a few comments about how I view that, but at the same time, I think it's been superseded almost from a technological point of view by this electronicization of society or this computerization of society. Bill Gates has had, at least as a symbolic figure, an historic impact upon our culture and society in the Western world, but there are others who are involved as well. The one comment I wanted to make, or expansion on that point, is about the multinational corporations. They firmly are in control. It's almost as if you look at the evolution of culture in the Western world, you see that nation-states are almost unimportant now. Now, of course, in the daily reporting of things, when journalists report things to you, it doesn't appear to be that way. And indeed, it doesn't mean that they're totally without power and they're totally without importance. Obviously, our government organizations, institutions continue to be important. But I think what is kind of hidden, what isn't known, is the role and the impact of multinational corporations. And sometimes what seems to be unanswerable, or we can't really find an answer for it. When we look at the role of multinational corporations, we sometimes can find an answer. And I would point, without knowing what the answer is, to a recent development that seems to have no explanation, and that would be Clinton's decision to free those activists who apparently committed some fairly violent acts in Puerto Rico. Why suddenly has he chosen to pardon them? I would suggest to you that there's a role of multinational corporations here that have some impact or some influence on those decisions. And those are the kinds of things that remain kind of unknown, unanswerable, and in the background. And I'm not necessarily a conspiracy theorist, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they have a role to play, and that, for example, you can see where certain industries, for example, become exceedingly important and exceedingly causative or causal in terms of events when they control certain products, natural products, which are essential for the industrial West, and the industrial world, non-Western too. For example, copper, I would just point out as one example of that we don't often think of. But many times you can explain what goes on in the entire continent of Africa by looking at the copper industry and the amount of copper that's available and who controls that supply and its abundance or lack of abundance. The same way that oil used to serve that kind of critical role before recent times, when you had then a more organized international committee of oil producers, oil-producing countries, which seems to not be able to cooperate or get together on production in a consistent way, so that the prices are not as predictable in terms of what they might be, say, a month from now. Right now they're pretty high, but we don't know that they will retain that high level of cost in the immediate future. Certainly it would help the economy of Texas, so I guess we're for that, but it'd be detrimental to the national economy of the United States and the West in general, so of course they're not for that. But see, what they seem to want, or what they seem to promote in terms of legislation, etc., doesn't really seem to have that much impact. In other words, multinational corporations as an organizational unit seems to have superseded nation-state political units and made them somewhat, or at least comparatively, certainly compared to previous centuries and times, somewhat impotent and less effective, E-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, than they would have been in the past. And I think that we haven't looked at that enough. And as anthropologists and as theoreticians looking at this connection between technology and culture, that's one of the areas that seems to be under examined, and something that we we need to examine in greater depth. So that's something that we'll be looking to. And then more importantly, though, I think is this role of computerization, this role of the electronicization of Western society. And indeed, if you can pay attention to those commercials you see on the Sunday morning talk shows anywhere in the world, you get this notion that, you know, a fisherman in Bangladesh has instant connection to the World Wide Web and can make decisions about his day's catch based on those kinds of input. I really, however, when I'm in a developing nation, don't really notice too many fisher people carrying around laptops or anything, so I think there may be a slight exaggeration there. But anyway, that's what we covered a little bit last time. And again, if you, to remind you of what those historical periods are about in terms of their actual history, capitalism triumphant is the 19th century, certainly the latter part of it, when capitalism was developing as an economic ideology, laissez-faire, and capitalism as a worldview was developing in the West, and certainly in the United States and in Europe. And as I mentioned last time, the concept of laissez-faire was important, the concepts and institutions of slavery and of other things that can be associated with this particular chapter in Western history were important. And we'll be talking about that a little more, maybe even today. The military-industrial complex, intermittent liberal reform, the second period in American history that I want to focus on, has to do with FDR and the New Deal, all the legislation and kinds of influences that Roosevelt had, the second Roosevelt, in terms of American history, and to show you that Franz Boas and, say, other people such as in sociology, Veblen, and in maybe jurisprudence would be Dewey and Brandeis, those folks had a lot of impact on American society at that time, and they were caught up in this impact of the Industrial Revolution even at that later date, and it brought about these periods of intermittent liberal reforms that we're referring to in that title. And then in 1969, from Dr. Wolf's point of view, he seemed to feel that where we were going was this military-industrial complex way. But you know, now that we've lived a little bit since 1969, or at least I have, I found that the military-industrial complex, certainly while very formative, very influential, it's not the only thing that's happening. In other words, I really see this potential for the electronicization, the computerization of society, to be really a technological event, if you will, in history that returns the local community to supreme importance, that gives individuals greater access to technology and to the benefits of technology. You know, computers are as significant in Western history, in my mind, as was the Gutenberg press in terms of its democratization of our society. And that's got to have some impacts on theoretical developments, some that are occurring at this very moment, but yet are not that apparent in terms of our literature, etc. But the next chapter in anthropological theory, indeed in social science theory, will be very importantly intertwined with this technological revolution that we're going through currently. Okay, what I want to focus on today, if there are no questions about any of that information again, is to talk something about the 19th century, both the early part of the 19th century and then, more importantly, the latter part of the 19th century, because that's when we begin to talk more directly and more specifically about what anthropologists said and anthropologists did. Okay. There's a lot of anthropology before the 19th century, certainly, and probably one of the most important developments, rather than going through that in any great detail, I just want to point out Positivism by Comte and his professor, or his intellectual predecessor, Saint-Simon, who developed that notion. And it really was an answer to theological propositions. Every chapter in theory, or every chapter in social sciences, again in general, and anthropology in particular, they're always carrying on an internal debate. And if you don't know who they're arguing with or who they're talking to, who their audience is, who their protagonist is, or antagonist in some cases, then you don't really understand why they're saying the kinds of things that they're saying. But one of the things that happened in the Enlightenment and other events prior to the 19th century was a development of a position that was contrary to theology. It was a position that was contrary to the notion of kind of a God as a master designer, urban planner, architect, social scientist par excellence, who kind of set the university up, who kind of created it, if you will, and then kind of set it in motion like a clock being wound real tight, and then you kind of let it unwind and until, I guess, Armageddon or what have you. And that's the way a lot of these folks saw it, so that there wasn't any understanding of human behavior beyond divine creation and explication. So people look to the scriptures prior to this time. If you look at the 15th century, the 14th century, into the Dark Ages, etc., you see that was the primary mode of, or resource that people utilized to explain, to the degree that they're even interested, human behavior, because these humans were seen as divine creations, and beyond that it was blasphemous and heresy to say anything else or in addition. So the positivists were the heroes of their time, even though in many circles today they are disparaged as being the kind of anti-hero. But at this time, when we look back on it, they really opened up our thoughts for being able to view humans in a very different way. They opened up our thoughts to be able to see that, number one, in general, not just social sciences, but that there was actually an objective reality apart from observers of that reality, or apart from this notion that God created the universe and we define that creation in terms of Him. This was a notion that there is a universe out there. It is objective. It's apart from us who observe it or any other being that might observe it, and that it is studyable, it is observable, and it is amenable to what was evolving at that time, which was a philosophy of science. It was a viewpoint. Now, obviously, if you think about it, the philosophy of science, when it developed, wasn't a part of farmers as they went about their daily chores in the United States, say, or we're talking about the 18th century now, or a part of even urban dwellers. They weren't really that caught up in those kinds of developments. Those kinds of developments were a part of the discussions that the elite had. Our history at that time is an elite history, because those are the people who had access to education. Those are the people who had access to these kinds of developments in thought. And it was not a part of general discussion. Sometimes there were these kinds of events, though, that promoted general discussions, and that would come about through literature. When I think of Charles Dickens as a figure in Western history and his impact, it's because we see his novels and we think they were published in such and such a time. Actually, Charles Dickens' novels were published as columns in newspapers, and people used to go to, that when a ship came in from England, they would rush in New York, they would rush to the docks to be the first to get copies of the latest installment in one of those novels that Dickens gave us. And so he told us a lot about what life was like at that time. And although it might not have been a discussion that intellectuals would have entertained, it was certainly part and parcel of a discussion that common folks might have been more involved in. So that goes a long way to explaining, for example, in the latter part of the 19th century, why there was widespread acceptance of social Darwinism when there was outright resistance to Darwinism. And a lot of that had been set in motion by these novels of Charles Dickens. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? So anyway, in this, the earlier part of the 19th century, beyond positivism, then, there were other kinds of developments. But positivism is the defining principle or concept, I think, for science, for at least science of that time, and that kind of science, if you will, has lasted to the present. Positivism is still an extremely important concept, and one I would expect you to know something about. It is this notion that there is, as I said, a physical universe out there that can be observed, it can be studied, it can be analyzed, and it is amenable to those kinds of treatments given it by the philosophers of the 18th century and others who developed this philosophy of science that we associate with this period in Western history called the Enlightenment. And these folks had notions also that human behavior also was amenable to scientific study and explication, which was, again, heresy. It was heretical. The church at that time might have given ground, as it were, with these notions that say rocks or chemicals might be amenable to the scientific investigation. But humans were, apart from all that, they were creations of the divine or the divinity, and as such, they weren't amenable to scientific investigation and exploration. But the folks in the 18th century and the Enlightenment changed all that, and they said, yes, they were. And that some of their thinking was summed up, I think, in this concept of positivism, again, as given us by Comte, C-O-M-T-E, and his intellectual predecessor, Saint-Simon, whose the pronunciation of that name I'm not really sure, but I'm assuming that's what it is. It's S-T period, capital S-I-M-O-N. Saint Simon is the way it looks like, but I would assume it doesn't have such a common or vulgar pronunciation, but I could be wrong. I wasn't alive in the 18th century, so I don't know. But these folks developed those notions, and they're very important, and they carried through. Then there was kind of a transition, as it were. When you get to the 19th century, something happens. All these advances, at least in thought, among the elite, seem to have gotten lost. You know, they were no longer caught up in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and debates seemed to go back to theologians, and debates were framed for the most part theologically. And in that theological debate, what became important during all of the 19th century, and in the first half, the theological framing of it became important in the first half of the 19th century, is this notion of evolution. Cultural evolution, not biological evolution. Even I have made some statements on occasion already about biology, and I keep referring to it. One of the things I think it's important, one aspect of science I think is important, is to realize that when people talked about biology, whether they were Herbert Spencer or earlier writers even, that they really didn't have the same notion of biology that you and I have today, and in fact, that you were educated in. It was a much more primitive notion of biology, as it were. So it's not the same thing. So it isn't that they had that great a deal of enlightenment and advancement. It was that they used biology as they understood it at that time. And certainly as a concept, cultural evolution is a much less adversarial or controversial, that's the word I'm looking for, notion than, say, is biological evolution as presented by Charles Darwin later in the 19th century. So in the first half of the 19th century, theologians debated evolution. And if you think about it, this isn't such a novel idea or event, because actually you can look at the Old Testament, those books that are covered in the, as known as the Torah. You know, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, starting with Genesis. This was really a chronicling of the Jewish people and their migrations and their wanderings in the area today that's known as the Middle East. And it talks about their cultural evolution. You know, anthropologists see this as a really hotbed, if you will, of cultural information and sources of information in terms of looking at the Old Testament, at that part of the Old Testament anyway, and the kind of information that it imparts about a group of people that lived in the Middle East at that time and that were adapted to that particular kind of environment in terms of their culture. A lot of the success of that culture had to do with the strength of the patriarchy in patriarchal notions among those people in that kind of environment. Something that might not be as effective a form of adaptation, culturally speaking, in current times, but we don't see it that way. We don't realize, or we don't always view the divine books of the, or whatever they are, of the Old Testament in that light. We don't see that. Maybe it may be dysfunctional in current times, those respective roles for males and females. And maybe we're wrong as anthropologists that way. Maybe those more traditional views of what it means to be a male and a female that evolved or were part and parcel of those notions that are in those first 5 books of the Old Testament. Maybe they're more relevant. Maybe they have greater truth than we realize. Certainly, if we look at some of the writings of current evolutionary psychologists, that certainly seems to be the case. I just gave an article that was published in the Houston Chronicle this summer to one of my graduate students in the graduate seminar to prepare for our next class, because in that very current theory of culture, or excuse me, of evolutionary psychology, they're talking about how it's if a chicken crosses the road. He's very humorous, this professor at the University of Texas. He said, if a chicken crosses the road, why does a chicken cross the road? Which is the question that we all ask or have heard ask. And of course, the silly answer is to get to the other side. But he goes further as an evolutionary psychologist, and he says a chicken crosses the road if it's a male to get to the pullet on the other side of the road. If it's a female, he says it's to get to the older, more powerful male person on the other side, or I guess a rooster in this case, on the other side of the road. And so he's going back to a more traditional notion of male and female, and he's doing it, however, in modern theoretical notions, and he says it has currency in terms of the very kinds of creatures that we are. If you haven't heard this phrase before, our human nature. And that is effective in terms of the developments that have occurred. Of course, we don't always agree with that, do we? And especially those of us who are of different political persuasions, etc. But we're not here today to talk about evolutionary psychology. I don't even know in this class if we will have time to get to that, because it's a very new development both in psychology and in anthropology. It's related, by the way, to something or schools of thought that we do have some interest in and have some literature on, and that would be sociobiology or psychobiology. But that's left to those student presentations in the second half of the course. So again, going back to the 19th century, or before this early part of the 19th century, what was this theological debate about? What were some of the basic premises or the basic arguments, just to give you a flavor of what it was about? If you'll look to what I've written on my pad of paper here, if the camera will go there, you'll see there are 2 words written, monogenesis and polygenesis. This is that debate. Now, what is monogenesis? What is polygenesis? Monogenesis was the ongoing conceptualization in the Western world, the cultural construct that had currency in the Western world. And it was this notion that there was one God, one deity, one supreme being, and there was an Adam and there was an Eve, and that all peoples in the world can be explained by this concept. Polygenesis came along as kind of an aberration in the early part of the 19th century. It's a different notion. It even went so far as to speculate there might have been several Adams and several Eves, and that each major racial grouping, as they understood race at the time, which of course is not our understanding of race. Our understanding of race has changed quite a bit. But at that time, they had a very different kind of notion of race, and sometimes we read things into this Races at this time, in this early time, really had more of a equivalency to tribal or to national groups or to something like that. Certainly that's what it had meant for the Greeks. But they postulated these notions. There would have been several Adams and Eve, so that those people that we describe today as African American, back in that time they described differently. They would have said they had a separate Adam and Eve, these theologians. And that people who are of Anglo descent had a different Adam and Eve. And in a way, this is the racist group, I suppose, of the time, although from my perspective, they were all racist, as indeed most people in Western culture have turned out to be on further inspection. And please don't be put off by that comment. It's just true. It's not something that I'm looking at you and I'm saying you're a racist. I'm saying if you have grown up in the Western world, if you're a member of Western culture, you haven't been able to escape racism. It's a part and parcel of this culture and society. And until we come to acknowledge that, we won't evolve in terms of ideas beyond it. I know when I once said that in this class in previous time, a student became extremely upset, unknown to me, and went to the dean to talk about it. So I did hear about it, but in a different context. But anyway, at this time, the polygenicists were those who believed in racial purity, and so they didn't even want their Adams and Eves mixing with those other folks' Adams and Eves. So they postulated these notions. And I'm going to read to you two definitions. I don't think it would show on camera. I'll put it there. Let's see how it looks on the camera. Probably can't see it. So, yeah, it's coming through pretty clear. Monogenesis is the doctrine that the human races constitute a single biological species. Now, you have to remember, biological for them was different than biological for us. So they constitute a single biological species. By the way, these definitions are found in your book by Erickson, A History of Anthropological Theory. That's where I've taken them from, so you don't have to look that far in terms of your resources. So again, the doctrine that the human race constitutes a single biological species with a common origin and, misspelled here, physical differences produced by natural agents over time. Polygenesis, the succeeding or the competing doctrine, is the one that human races constitute separate species with separate origins and physical differences that are unalterable and racially innate. So they're looking at something that anthropologists have always been, I indicated earlier in an earlier lecture, that we'll always have been concerned, those of us who are anthropologists and those of us who had anthropological thoughts before anthropology became a defined discipline. We always had this curiosity in why or how human beings differed or varied from one another. And these folks also have that concern, and that's what they're talking about. But obviously they explain it in very different ways. They're looking to, again, the Old Testament for their arguments, but they're phrasing it in terms of variation among peoples in the world. And they're explaining the fact that people appear to be different from each other in their appearance for different reasons. The monogenicists are saying it's due to physical differences that are brought about by natural agents. I suppose that would be something like, I'm sure you heard of it, those people who are African American have the skin color that they do, not to the melanin that's in their skin, or the difference, absence or presence of it in their skin, but rather it was due to the fact that they had been exposed to the sun, that scorching sun in Africa and other areas of the world like that for long periods of time, and it produced those changes. You know, there's a form of evolution that we don't always mention that much that paralleled Darwin, but was also preceded him, which is important, which is Lamarckian evolution. I think it's spelled M-A-R-C-K. And Lamarck had also this notion that you could bring about changes in the physical appearance of peoples by exposing them to, quote, natural agents. So people who read his writings would, when the woman was with child, about to bear or whatever, during her pregnancy or period of confinement, she would play the piano a lot. And by doing that, she thought that her child might become Mozart or Beethoven or what have you. Or when children appeared with birthmarks, red blotches like Gorbachev had on his forehead, they would say that's due to the fact maybe that the mother ate strawberries while she was in her period of confinement, and that's the way it expressed itself. Too many strawberries there, Mr. Gorbachev. Now today we laugh at those notions, but it has to do with this monogenesis, a kind of view of change in physical characteristics among populations in this early 19th century. And that is that they came about through natural agents over time. Polygenesis, as I say, it's a much more, not radical as I start, it's a much more extreme, I would say, in our terms, conservative. I don't mean it in terms of conservatives today in political discussions, but rather conservative in the sense of going back to a more extreme position that allowed Anglos to retain this distinctiveness that they seem to become increasingly concerned with over time, and in the 20th century eventually led to discussions of Aryan races and racial supremacy and what's the great race of whatever, and all those discussions that today appall us to some extent, but with the genetic manipulation that's going on now, it's going to become a much more acceptable concept, I fear, in the very near future, as genetics as a separate science is evolving into the present period, and is something that we might become concerned with in a future version of this class. But again, at this time, polygenesis is this doctrine that human races constitute very separate species. And by species, they just mean a group of people that are apart from each other. They have nothing to do with one another. They're not saying that a species in the sense of Homo sapiens sapiens versus, say, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis or something like that. They were not nearly that scientifically informed, and nor did they have a notion of those kinds of species separation. And those groups then have separate origins, very individual origins. In a way, then, this is the way they explained racial, what we call today racial differences. It's not what scientists call racial differences. Race is a very, very strange concept in Western civilization, and it has evolved, at least in anthropologically scientific circles, to be a concept that has little validity because it is so associated with baggage, cultural baggage, if you will, that comes from this era of our history as well as succeeding periods of history that make it almost an unusable term, scientifically speaking. And if you've had a course, say, either from Dr. Hutchinson in the anthropological concept or notions of race, or if you've had courses from Dr. Story on human variation, I'm sure that you've had some of this information already. And if not, you would understand this information readily because it does relate to those notions. Okay, so these, again, were theological debates. They had little to do with anthropology, and they had little to do with all those discoveries or ideas like light bulbs going on in people's heads during the 18th century. Those kinds of discussions, those notions of humans as legitimate topics for study by the scientific method, that they were a part of the natural universe and that there was a way of studying humans as just parts of the natural universe. All of that was lost temporarily. We seem to have gone into, if you will, a kind of dark age of our own. And the debate became diminished, I think, in terms of its framing only by theologians. And theologians, I think you can see, have not the highest intellectual acumen. Again, I hope I'm not offending anyone. That's just what our history was about. And these were debates carried on in the pulpit, by the way. These weren't the theologians in the University of Chicago or Harvard or Yale or something like that that were developing thoughts for Christians or, say, Judaic scholars for Jewish folks. No, it was people arguing this in their pulpits about, how do you explain where all the peoples of the world come from. I remember when I was a kid, I don't know if you had this thing or not, I think that was one of the things that drew me to anthropology, was that, in my Presbyterian teachings, ministers and Sunday school teachers used to tell me, I would ask them questions, where did all these people come from in the world? That are different than those of us who were in a Presbyterian church in a working class, middle class neighborhood in Danville, Illinois in the 40s, which was when I was a kid and went to Sunday school. And by the way, at that time they used to turn the Sunday school class over to me, so I was a lecturer even then. Although on a very different topic and a very different point of view. I remember asking those questions and the teachers couldn't tell me. Yes, push your, yeah.
As a young person in the Roman Catholic Church, where I was brought up in a Polish community of first-generation immigrants, I was made to believe that everyone other than our Christian group were going to go to hell. Mm-hmm. And I knew there was something really wrong with that, and so I started working that out for myself from that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not dissimilar to my own thinking, and my questions were, why missionaries? Why do we need to go to all parts of the world and preach the gospel? Because I was interested in doing that. I think that was one of my first statements of anthropological interest without realizing that it was anthropology. And of course I was asking the questions that theologians introduced in the early part of the 19th century, but as a kid of 6 or 7 I didn't know this. I just thought, I was asking the questions that came to my mind, and of course the answers given were the same ones given in this early part of the 19th century. Okay, all that aside, and my personal history aside, and thank you for your input, I appreciate it. We now go to the 19th century, or the latter part of the 19th century, and we're getting to, at this point, something monumental happened, something monumental occurred, and it changed Western culture, Western history, Western peoples forever. And it probably has had an impact on all peoples of the world, not just Western people. And that was the publication in 1859 of Darwin's Origin of the Species. Who would have known that one book or one person's writings could have so much influence, such permeated influence, just going throughout and permeating all aspects of our society, changing, I think, in very significant, lasting ways, our perception of the world. Whether we're religious or irreligious or a-religious or whatever, it has impacted us. Whether we're Southern Baptists, Roman Catholics, atheists, agnostics, Jewish, whatever, I'm Muslim, it has impacted us. It has changed our thought, our perception, our worldview. Obviously not all in the same way. We don't yet think all alike, thank heavens. And there are arguments that still occur. But it was a seminal event in history. It changed thinking forever. And at this point, it was still a moment in history that was a part of the intellectual elite, if you will, the aristocracies of Western countries. It was not something that, say my own ancestors were involved in or knew about or took part in. No, they came to know it in a very different way. And for those of you who've had these required American history courses, you probably have already been exposed to the thinking of this time, and something that we might want to talk about in terms of the cultural shaping of this time, and that is, what am I going to talk about? Social Darwinism, right. that phrase also was used. I mean, people talked about social Darwinism. They knew what that was, and they knew what it meant. Do you? Are you yet up with the latter part of the 19th century? Or do you have one of the greatest minds of the 17th? Anybody tell me what social Darwinism is, just generally? And if you raise your hand to tell me, all you have to do is press your microphone, and you'll be on television. Yes.
Okay. The theory that all societies pass through stages of universal evolution.
That's good. What else? What would it mean to your mother and father? How did they talk about it? That's more of a textbook kind of definition, right? But what would have been a common popular notion of social Darwinism that's current even today? I mean, if you listen to a politician more towards the conservative side, we often say Republican, but there are some Democrats as well, you're going to hear an argument that's pretty social Darwinistic. What was it? Or what is it? And if you don't know, I'm appalled. Yes, oh no, over here. Yes, thank you.
It's the idea that the people who are most successful or at the top of society are there because there's something innately better about them or more suited to survival or to being successful than the others.
Say it now in terms of survival. Use that concept and see where that takes you.
Well, survival of the fittest.
Thank you. You remember, of course, most of you don't remember. I have this memory that goes back several generations now, and I forget that. And I expect you all to know what I know because I'm alive and you're alive, and of course we share this great moment in history. But of course, I've been alive more moments in history than most of you have. And I remember in the 70s when Nixon talked about spurring development, economic development in black communities or African American communities in the United States. He wanted to introduce capitalism there. You know, he thought that would be great, and it really was a notion about survival of the fittest, although reframed, mind you, and rephrased in terms of the dialogue or the discourse of the 1970s, especially the early 1970s. And that led to his notion later on that maybe, for someone else said that maybe we should, I think, Moynihan, who's the outgoing senator from New York, was the one who said this. He's a sociologist, if you didn't know that. And in one of his books that he wrote with Nathan Glazer, he talks about how we need to leave African Americans in the ghettos of the larger cities in terms of benign neglect. So he's not, if you hadn't realized it, one of the more liberal members of the Democratic Party. But anyway, all those political commentaries aside, the latter part of the 19th century was greatly impacted by Darwin and the publication of The Origin of the Species and these notions of social Darwinism. It is the prevailing points of view, if you will, the prevailing worldview that's given in the Victorian era. This is what you were encouraged to think when you lived, if you were alive in this Victorian era. And what did they think? Well, as she was indicating, as Darla was indicating, it had to do with, an important way, was survival of the fittest. Life, again, in Charles Dickens' novels, was presented as a pretty ugly place. If you were Oliver Twist and Fagin was your adversary and you lived in that part of London, London was not a nice place. There was those seamy sides or underbellies of English society where you had lots of poor people, and these children were being trained to be thieves and beggars who manipulated folks who came into their area or they came into contact with. And this didn't give a vision of human nature that was genteel or aristocratic or educated or whatever. It gave you a view of human nature, a perception, if you will, that people were evil, that people were capable of pretty heinous behaviors. Even little kids. You couldn't even trust little kids in these novels, right? Except, of course, for the pure of heart, like Oliver Twist, who was given those moments of contact, if you will, with members of the aristocracy, with members of the upper class, who reached down kind of and picked him out of that horrible circle of thieves created by Fagin, and who brought him these notions. These are themes in Darwinian novels that go from one to the other, and there are always these creatures in each case. It's almost, and that's what captured the minds of people in the latter part of the 19th century. They really identified with these folks and the heroines and the heroes and those people that were larger than life. But they were always somewhere embroiled. There's this undercurrent of people who are folks who were in the lower classes. See, lower class was almost seen as a disease. Being poor or having poverty was almost seen as being a result of being evil. And there were two kinds of folks, good folks and bad folks. And bad folks lived in the poor areas, and good folks lived in the good areas of town, or the places where the aristocracy lived. There's almost a parallel development in a current novelist, but I don't know if it can be stretched that far. But if any of you are fans of Stephen King, the horror, he writes horror books supposedly, although I've never seen any of them as particularly horrible. But in those books, he's always talking, there's almost always two kinds of folks in there. There's always people who live on one side of the tracks and people who live on the other side of the tracks. And I remember this was especially developed in a novel called Cujo, about the dog that goes mad from being rabid, or rabid, whatever it's called. And in that novel, those folks that had that dog that unleashed them on people were considered to be kind of the wrong people. And wrong people in Stephen King's novels are almost always poor people. Or not poor people so much as not rural, more redneck than anything else, but living in all kinds of contexts. I don't know what goes on in Maine that gives him these points of view, or that inspires him to create people in two forms in modern day communities around Bangor, Maine, which is of course where he writes and lives. But I see that as a parallel kind of development as this notion of two groups of people in Darwinian literature as well. But again, this impacted people, this affected people, and they thought of the world out there as being a cruel, hostile place that was just like a jungle. And that in that jungle environment, you really had to kind of fight your way to the top by claw and nail, as they say, and get there. And if you didn't fight your way to the top, if you didn't become a species that was superior, you would lose and you would disappear. And the great, cultural evolutionary demise of those folks who weren't as competitive, who weren't as adaptive. And think how this feeds into capitalism. This prepares people to accept capitalist ideas and notions. One industry competes with another industry, and the industry that's superior, that's better, that has a product that's clean and pure, is the industry that survives. I remember when I was a kid, when I first was introduced to television, I watched soap operas with my mother, As the World Turns, and another one, I can't remember what, Secret Storm. Very early versions of those. They would always have these soap commercials. And they would have say Oxidol or some other, I don't know if I'm supposed to be mentioning brand names on television or not. But anyway, they would have these soap brands, and they would say, new, improved Fab with green crystals in them called Oxidol. How you give you some long scientific term, right, which I had no idea what it was. But I knew one thing, that the soap, the detergent, with that green chemical in it was superior to that version of that soap without the green chemical in it. And that the superior version of it was going to win out. And that's the way Madison Avenue framed those innovations, if you will, and that's why it has such widespread popular appeal. It goes back to this time. It goes back to this, really, these notions, capitalistic notions that all of us share in, believe in, are provided a point of view, and we never realize where they're coming from. If you're looking for a car, and you have a car that has, what would be an innovation today? Have those maps in it. You can push a button and you have a road map right in front of you. Well, obviously that's better than my car that doesn't have that. I always need a map when I'm going from here to the university. I don't at all. But somehow you're told that you do and that you're less than if you don't. So if your car doesn't have those maps, you're not going to be the one who survives in this survival of the fittest. You're not going to be among the fittest, so beware. But that's just an advertising gimmick. But it's something that's very culturally tailored, that fits very well with these ideologies, these worldviews that were given to us in this latter part of the 19th century by this publication of The Origin of the Species. This is the way it became translated, if you will, to the masses. And the way it became translated in many ways was through the writing, at least as I perceive it, through authors such as Charles Darwin. Now, I never realized that until I started thinking about it. But it's kind of like these authors prepared the way. They made people ready to accept these kinds of notions and to accept these kinds of interpretations of historical events around them. All right, there were other events, other kinds of innovations, other kinds of developments which prepared people to accept anthropology and these notions of cultural evolution that we'll be talking about probably in the next lecture, which occurs on Thursday, I believe. What were those events? Well, there were things out there. You know, you gotta kind of transport yourself back in time. Pretend you're in a time machine and go back to 1859 and what the world was like then, at least in terms of what you were encouraged to think, the kinds of ideas that you were encouraged to have, and the way in which you perceive the world. But there were some things that were occurring that kind of caused people to have misgivings about those dominant theological notions, about what you heard at Sunday school and church, because that viewpoint, pretty much permeated Victorian society and culture. But there were things that were causing, some of that mortar in that wall to decompose, metaphorically speaking. And one of those, something that archaeologists would want me to talk about, and that is the widespread distribution of arrowheads. Now, you can go to anywhere in the rural United States, almost anywhere, and if you do what do archaeologists call it? You do a survey on top of the ground. There's a phrase for that. What do they call that? They're not excavating yet. It's the preliminary stuff. They're going through it, and they're going to try to determine if there might be a site in that area, so they look for surface collections. You understand what I'm talking about, even if you don't know the phrase for it. Maybe there isn't a technical term for it. I always think it should be technical. Anyway, arrowheads are just common. Those projectile points that you find in many different parts of the New World. And in fact, the Old World. In Africa, in Asia, really throughout the world, you find all these little stone creations, products, that were scattered on the surface of the earth, and which people found. Some people like to collect them. Some people have been collecting them for a long time, even in the last century. But what to make of these? We had another group of artifacts, if you want to call them that were around, that were little round stone creations or products that were called eoliths. E-O-L-I-T-H-S. I'll write that down because I don't think it's in your readings anywhere. Oops. Eoliths. And you'll know that term if any of you are familiar with this time in American and Western history, because it gave rise to a period of time called the Eolithic. It was supposed to be like the dawn of time. Well, it turns out all these had nothing to do with human production at all. They had nothing to do. They were just found everywhere. Anywhere you have a riverbed, you have smooth rocks, you have eoliths. It has nothing to do with human creation or human intention or some human having an idea, this is what I want to make, this is what I have to have, therefore I'll create it or produce it with this technology that I have over here. Eoliths are not that kind of thing, right? So I'll just get rid of them like that. I don't think that showed on television, but I'll wad it up. It was a bad thinking, and it was a bad and uninformed chapter by scientists who had maybe some more important things to say about other later developments. So that aside, we have these widespread distribution of arrowheads or projectile points found everywhere. And some people were able to look at those and they were able to tell that these are different than just accidental creations like that you might find in a riverbed by being worn smooth by rivers running over them thousands of years or something like that. No, this was different. Those among you who are archaeology concentrators, how do you know that a stone chip over here may look like this mouse on this computer or whatever? Maybe it's that size. It could be a lot smaller. It could be a lot larger. How do you know that it's made by humans? How do you know that there's intentional development? How do you know this rock has something that was created and this rock over here is just a rock? How do you know that? Come on, I'm the cultural anthropologist, I'm the ethnologist, I'm not the archaeologist. How do you know that? How many of you are archaeology concentrators? And the camera's not on you, so don't worry about it. How many of you are? No one in here does anything in archaeology. Well, that's interesting. I think your professors may have something to say about that. Yes?
Well, I guess from the appearance, as we have learned from other appearances, it's been interpreted for us by professional people, and also...
But what do they interpret?
The context. Excuse me?
What do they interpret? How do they know? Obviously, the professionals tell us, but what do they tell us? Yes?
About the markings on the rocks and stuff, and the way...
Markings on the rock. What kind of markings? Anybody else tell me, or can you tell me what those might be, what they might appear to be? Well,
I would say there's different patterns you can look at in terms of the rock structure, like how if it's vertical lines hitting them, or if you take.
Well, there's some evidence, isn't there? That you look at that rock and you know that this is a platform that they use to chip at. You know, of course, it has to be a certain kind of material, right? Like, what's the material that was most often used for stone tools? Thank you. I know you had some archaeology. Flint. You know, and flint is a material that's very amenable to these kinds of creations by humans. And flint is widespread in certain areas of the world and was used by lots of different human groups, totally separated from one another. And you, as an archaeologist, though, you can look at those, quote, projectile points or those stone tools, and you can tell they are intentional products by human beings because they have certain kinds of, as he called them, markings on them. They have striking platforms, they have bulbs of percussion, and there are patterns to them. They are made this way in this spot, and nearby they're made in almost exactly the same way in another spot. You know, there's some similarity. There is a patterning to them. So, when people were trying to impose or continue with this theological view of the world, that Christ is in heaven and God is in heaven and all the good people are up there in the upper classes and telling us what to do in the lower classes. Of course, see where I identify myself. You know, this was a contrary to that. How did you explain these evidences of peoples all throughout the world? Again, these are found in North America, they're found in South America, they're found in Asia, they're found in Africa, they're found in Europe, they're found in all parts of the world, many parts of the world. And yet there's no mention in the Old Testament, and I challenge my TV audience as well, there's no mentioning anywhere, as far as I know, in the Old Testament about peoples existing prior to those people chronicled in the Old Testament. The Jewish people and the Egyptians and people that we think of and know about from history. In other words, these would be what our archaeologists and others of us call prehistorical folks, people who existed at a time before, at that moment, was the present world. And especially that would have been revolutionary thoughts for Europe, I mean, here's Europe. Europe is seen as the byproduct of Italians or Romans, as the case may be, spreading out from that part of the Mediterranean area into Gaul, what is today called France. I still remember my phrase from in Latin class, Gallia est divisa in tres partes. It's probably some Spanish influence there in the way I say tres partes. But nonetheless, I remember that phrase, and it had to do with the invasion of Gaul, or that part of Europe, and how, it turns out there were people there, and there's some references to people being there prior to the incoming folks from the Roman Empire. But we don't know much about them. And they certainly, again, they're not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. These are historical documents that give reference to them. And we know something about them sometimes because of the linguistic evidence they leave behind. If any of you have ever heard of Bas, B-A-S, B-A-S-Q-U-E-S. Who are the Bas? Anybody know where they're found?
North of Spain and
in northern Spain and southern France, right? They're a group of people who have a separate language, a separate cultural tradition, a separate ethnic identity, if you will, and they keep, or at least in earlier times, they used to keep going into the Spanish, what would be comparable to our Congress, and shooting things up a bit and killing some folks and getting some attention because they wanted to secede or separate from what is today Spain and or France. And of course, there's resistance to that. If you go to, I'm going to forget the name of the city now on the Mediterranean. That's very importantly a part of this. The city in Spain, I'm trying to think of. It starts with a C. Well, whatever. I'll know it next time and tell you. And that may not be C, it may be C. Oh, it's Barcelona. See, it's not C, it's B. But I remember being there and listening to the Basque language. It's a wonderful language. The only other place it's spoken in the world is in Idaho. And that's because there was a migration of Basque from that area of the old world to the new world. Mainly it was to areas of Idaho that were very comparable in terms of the climate and the environment, and they could become goat herders there as well. And there's a kind of a Basque enclave, if you will, in that area of the United States. But these folks are quite interesting because, linguistically speaking, there are no known relatives of their language. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say just one thing that, I mean, the Basques, there is only a 15% that
right.
are, I'm from Spain, so
yeah, okay, good.
That only 15% are taking that route of violence, and
of the
these
people?
are, yeah, so
okay.
these, and they are called ETA, which means Euskadi Tarkartasuna, which means Euskadi, which is their place, free. That's what it means. But this is not all the Basques.
Okay,
this is just like the group. We could say that the most part want to be independent, but about terrorism, it's only it's been given just that it's only 15%.
Yeah, well, thank you for that input. You're the first person from Spain that's ever, come back and answered that way. I guess what I'm referring to, though, is why would we in this class have heard of the Basque people? And that's because of these incidents that occurred. And I didn't mean to imply, and thank you for correcting me, that they're a part of what it means to be Basque or whatever. But rather, that's how we know about them. That's how we know of them. That's how I know of them. But anyway, their language is what really interests me as an anthropologist, the politics aside. And the language, and one of the reasons it interests me is because we have no known relatives to these languages. If we take Spanish, we know Spanish is related to the Latin that was spoken by the Romans as they went into the West, into what is today Western Europe. If we look at German as a language today, we know that it has historical ancestors in terms of Teutonic peoples that were in that area, and we can take it back in time. That we can take all languages back in time, if you will, those languages that I just mentioned, rather, not with the exception of the Basque language, and also some Finno-Ugrian groups. We can't take those back in time. There are some like residual pockets of people around Europe, and other parts of the world, that we can't explain what their origins are or where they came from, because they were peoples that were there before the Romans got there, and these are the leftovers. These are the ones who survived. They were either strong enough in numbers, or there was some strength of their cultural tradition that defied being overrun and overcome, and, if you will, assimilated into what would have been Latin culture of that time. So the Bachs provide for those of us who are more linguistically oriented a real treasure, if you will, of looking at their language and seeing its development and realizing at one time it would have been much more widespread. It would have been much more involved than just the, I think it's the, is it the Catalonian part of Spain? Is it Catalonia? I'm not sure. I may have that wrong. Yeah. Okay. It's separate from Catalonia then. Okay. But anyway, I always found that fascinating and a reminder of this, that the westward expansion of the Romans was not complete, and one of the evidences we have is these folks such as the Basques. Okay. In this area of Europe, though, there were all these arrowheads around. There were all these projectile points that you could just find by walking, down a pasture. You can still do it today, at least in Illinois and Indiana, in my area of the world. If it hasn't been part of a development yet, if we don't have new houses and townhouses there, you can just reach down and you can find these things called arrowheads. So this widespread availability of these projectile points in many different parts of the world is evidence that there were humans that existed at a time before writing was available, before text was something that we could talk about, and that was not accounted for in, quote, the New Testament or the Old Testament or any testament. And that left holes, if you will, in those theological points of view and arguments. All right, there's another area that also made theological arguments at this time weaker and were put forth by folks who had access to education, had access to being a member of the upper class or the aristocracy or the elites of that time. And most of you, I'm sure, at one time or another have heard of, I don't know if I'm being excessive in my use of paper here, Lyell, who is a geologist and who had some developments in the 19th century, or some thinking, that challenged, very importantly, these theological contentions. He came up with a doctrine of Uniformitarianism, which is one of the longest words in the English language, if not the longest. In fact, I can't write it. I have to put the ism down here. Uniformitarianism. And what do you think that's about? What do you think that was such an important idea? What was its major impact? What is uniformitarianism?
It's the idea that what we see in the world today, in nature, that those patterns have always happened, so therefore you can look back into time and figure out what happened, that it would follow the same patterns as what's happening now.
And what about this might intrigue archaeologists, certainly in terms of their methodology and in terms of their being able to reconstruct or recover prehistory? What about it? She said it allows us to go back in time and think about where are we going back in time from, though? What's going on here? What's uniform? He's a geologist. Now, what do geologists study? The Earth, right? And so what might this, by the way, the opposite point of view at this time was called catastrophism, which is a word related to catastrophe, which is in some ways, one version of catastrophe is creation, or creationism as it's called today. In other words, the thing I heard in my science class in high school, an example of catastrophism would have been, you might have had a little pool of water here and the lightning hit it and tadpoles were suddenly there. So you had, creation of life by really moments, if you will, in history, whether those wherever those moments came from, whether life came from a lightning or whether it came from a divinity. And of course, creationism is one example, or it can be. Obviously, there are different views of creationism by creationists, but one view of creationism is that all things living were created by God instantaneously and separately. You know, one species is not related to another species. Rather, God created the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air. See how biblical I can be? And this has to do with kind of a notion of catastrophism, right? Obviously, they didn't see it that way, but that's a term that lots of folks were talking about, lots of thinkers who called themselves biologists and other kinds of scientists in these earlier times thought about and talked about. And they had theories that were of this catastrophic nature. But Lyell came along and said, well, that isn't the way it is. When I look at the earth, I see it as very developed over time and as standard stratigraphy, if that's a word that means something to those among you who are archaeologists. Okay, we're running out of time for today, and what I've talked about primarily has been ideas in the 19th century, both the early part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 19th century, and we will continue this discussion next time. And I thank you very much, and have a good day.